The Confederation of aligned stellar nations had, over the course of 17,000 standard cycles, perfected the art of not dying in space. They had emergency protocols for hull breaches, atmospheric contamination, gravitational anomalies, and even the exceptionally rare spontaneous quantum unraveling incident that had claimed 3 ships in the Beltrax sector. What they had not perfected, apparently, was preventing a cargo hauler's navigation computer from having what could only be described as an existential crisis at the worst possible moment. The transport vessel Meridian's Edge carried a crew of 7 and enough emergency equipment to theoretically survive on a barren moon for 6 months. Theoretically being the operative word, because theory assumed the emergency equipment would survive the same catastrophic failure that necessitated its use. The galaxy, as it turned out, had a sense of irony sharper than a Krell warrior's honor blade. Most species in the Confederation had evolved past the need for primitive survival skills roughly around the same time they discovered fire was useful for more than religious ceremonies. When a Vexian merchant found themselves stranded, they activated their distress beacon and waited patiently for rescue, which typically arrived within 72 hours. When a Thorian explorer crashed on an inhospitable world, they sealed themselves in whatever remained of their vessel and trusted in the elaborate network of emergency response teams scattered across civilized space. The concept of actually doing something about one's predicament, using nothing but raw materials and questionable judgment, had become as antiquated as believing in sky spirits or eating solid food. Humans, bless their stubborn little hearts, had somehow missed that particular evolutionary memo. The Meridian's Edge didn't so much crash as it did perform an aggressive unscheduled landing on a planet that looked like it had been specifically designed by a committee of sadists. Designation KX-774, unofficial designation among the crew, approximately 3 seconds after visual contact. Oh hell no. The planet's surface resembled what would happen if someone took every inhospitable feature in the galaxy, mixed them in a bowl, and then set the bowl on fire. Obsidian plains stretched toward horizons, shimmering with heat distortion. Rivers of molten rock carved glowing orange scars across the landscape. The atmosphere, while technically breathable, had the quality of air that made you reconsider whether breathing was really all that important. The escape pods scattered across a relatively flat area of cooled lava, which was similar to saying they landed on the comfortable section of a torture device. 6 pods, 7 crew members, and exactly 0 good options. The pods, designed by engineers who had clearly never experienced a real emergency, had suffered enough damage during the descent to render their climate control systems questionable and their communications equipment thoroughly deceased. Captain Zakara, whose crystalline physiology meant she experienced temperature as a series of harmonic vibrations, emerged from her pod and immediately began vibrating at a frequency that translated to profound distress. Emergency beacon is transmitting. Rescue operations will commence within standard protocols. Estimated arrival 26.3 hours. Quinn, the avian descended navigator, whose feathers were already beginning to singe in the heat, clicked his beak in what passed for acknowledgement among his species. 26 hours in this thermal nightmare. Excellent. I've always wanted to know what braised quillian tastes like. The twin-bonded geological specialists, Brask and Yerin, huddled together in their shared pod, their 4 eye stalks extended toward the hellscape outside. The atmospheric composition is technically survivable, Brask observed with the enthusiasm of someone describing a terminal illness. Technically, Yerin added, is doing some heavy lifting in that sentence. Torix, sealed in his environmental suit because his methane-based biology found oxygen about as pleasant as most species found swimming in acid, performed scans of the surrounding area. Temperature at ground level, 47 degrees Celsius. Toxic particulate matter index, moderately concerning. Probability of comfortable survival until rescue statistically insignificant. Which left Vex Marlowe, the human engineer who had spent the crash performing emergency repairs that had probably saved all their lives, though he'd never mentioned it. Humans rarely mentioned when they did something heroic, preferring instead to downplay their achievements with phrases like "it was nothing" or "anyone would have done it," which was statistically false but culturally significant. He stood outside his pod, hands on hips, surveying the landscape with an expression that the others couldn't quite interpret. Humans were still relatively new to the Confederation, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 3 centuries prior, which meant their facial expressions remained largely mysterious to species who communicated through color changes, pheromones, or interpretive clicking. "Right then," Vex said, which was apparently human for something. "I'm going for a walk." 7 eyes, 4 eye stalks, and 1 crystalline sensory array focused on him with varying degrees of disbelief. A walk, Zakara's translator rendered her harmonic vibrations as severely skeptical. "Engineer Marlowe, the ambient temperature alone will cause tissue damage within." "Yeah, I know," Vex interrupted, already moving toward a pile of obsidian chunks approximately 50 meters from the pods. "Back in a bit." Quinn's head rotated in that disconcerting way avian species managed, a full 180 degrees that made several crew members deeply uncomfortable every single time. "Has he suffered cranial trauma? Should we restrain him for his own safety?" Torix's suit speakers crackled with static before his translated voice emerged. "Human stress responses are documented as occasionally irrational. However, his vital signs appear normal, elevated, but within parameters for his species under duress." They watched through the pod's external cameras as Vex began picking up rocks. Not frantically, not with the desperate energy of someone whose mind had broken under pressure, but with the methodical focus of someone who had a plan. He selected obsidian chunks, tested their weight, set some aside, and rejected others. He dragged a piece of crash debris, twisted metal that had once been part of the cargo hold, and began using it as a makeshift lever. "What?" Brask asked the question they were all thinking. "Is he doing?" Vex would have been happy to explain, had anyone asked, that humans had spent roughly 300,000 years figuring out how not to die in places that actively wanted to kill them. Before humans had computers, they had caves. Before they had caves, they had the profound, stubborn refusal to accept that the universe's hostility was a personal affront. Humanity's ancestors had looked at ice ages, predators with impressive dental work, and the general indifference of nature, and decided that the appropriate response was not to wait politely for death, but to hit things with rocks until the situation improved. The first hour, Vex focused on location. The crash site sat on a relatively flat obsidian plain, but approximately 70 meters north. 2 formations of cooled lava created a natural windbreak. More importantly, the formations angled in such a way that they'd provide shade for at least part of the day and shelter from the worst of the heat radiating off the plains. He marked the spot by piling stones, then began the tedious process of hauling materials. Obsidian, for all its impracticality as a building material on civilized worlds, had certain advantages when one's construction site was literally surrounded by it. It fractured predictably along clean lines, created relatively flat surfaces when properly broken, and had excellent thermal properties that would prove useful for what Vex had in mind. He selected pieces ranging from fist-sized to roughly the dimensions of a large watermelon, though he probably would have objected to that comparison since watermelons were food, and these rocks were about to become architecture. Inside the pods, the crew watched with increasing fascination as a pattern emerged. The human wasn't randomly stacking stones like some primitive ritual. He was building something with clear intention and surprising technical knowledge. Foundation structure, Torix narrated, his analytical mind cataloging each action with scientific precision. He's creating a base layer using larger stones, positioning them to create a level surface despite the uneven substrate. The gaps between stones are being filled with smaller fragments. He's compensating for thermal expansion and ground instability. Why? Quinn's feathers ruffled with agitation, small particles of ash dislodging and floating away on superheated air currents. The pods provide shelter, damaged shelter admittedly, but superior to piles of volcanic rock assembled by hand. Jakara's crystalline form refracted the harsh light into rainbow patterns that danced across the obsidian ground. I believe we are observing a primitive instinct. Humans evolved in environments requiring manual shelter construction. His biology may be compelling him to nest. Nest? Yerin's eye stalks contracted in thought, a gesture that indicated deep consideration among their species. That would imply he intends to create something permanent, or at least semi-permanent. In 4 hours, Brask made a sound like grinding stone, their species' equivalent of derisive laughter. Impossible. Complex structures require planning, materials processing, tool fabrication. He has none of these advantages. Vex, blissfully unaware of the debate his actions had sparked, moved into hour 2 with the grim determination of someone who'd once spent a weekend assembling furniture with instructions written in 3 languages, none of which he spoke. The foundation complete, he began building walls. Not solid walls, because solid walls would trap heat and make the interior about as comfortable as a crematorium, which was not the aesthetic he was going for. Instead, he stacked the obsidian to create double-layered walls with a gap of approximately 15 centimeters between them. The gap, as any human who'd paid attention in basic physics could tell you, would create an insulating airspace. Hot air would rise through the gap, creating convection that would actually draw heat away from the interior rather than letting it accumulate. It was a principle humans had used in architecture for millennia, from Roman hypocausts to double-paned windows to the breathing walls of ancient Persian ice houses. The aliens, who had climate-controlled habitats and rarely considered why their shelters worked beyond technology makes it so, found the concept simultaneously novel and obvious in hindsight. Torix emerged from his pod, servos in his environmental suit, whining as he crossed the distance to where Vex worked. The suit's legs left deep impressions in the ash-covered obsidian, marking his passage like breadcrumbs through a particularly inhospitable forest. Engineer Marlowe, your cardiovascular system is under significant stress. Core temperature elevated. Hydration levels suboptimal. I must recommend you return to the pods and cease this activity. Vex, in the process of wedging an obsidian slab into position between 2 larger foundation stones, grunted with effort. Can't. Need to finish walls before I lose the light. He glanced at the position of the system's sun, a bloated red giant that bathed everything in orange light, that made the landscape look like a Renaissance painting of damnation. 3 hours, maybe less. Finish walls for what purpose? Shelter. Vex stepped back, examined his work with a critical eye, and apparently found it satisfactory despite the structure's rough appearance. The walls had reached roughly waist height, forming a rectangular structure approximately 4 meters by 3 meters. Plenty of space for 7 beings of various sizes and atmospheric requirements. With a fireplace, Torix's translator couldn't quite capture the confusion in his native language, which involved both chemical signals and ultrasonic frequencies, but it made a valiant attempt. You intend to create fire on a planet that is essentially already fire. Not for heat, Vex said, already moving to gather more materials, his boots crunching on loose obsidian gravel. For cooking and comfort. Mostly comfort, if I'm honest. There's something psychologically beneficial about having a controlled fire when everything around you wants to kill you. Makes the hindbrain feel better. The human statement rippled through the crew's communication channel like a stone thrown into still water. Quinn voiced what they all thought, his translator rendering his clicks into words dripping with concern. He's insane. The thermal stress has damaged his cognitive functions. We should sedate him before he injures himself. But Sakura, who had been observing with increasing interest, vibrated at a contemplative frequency that her translator rendered with unusual poetry. Or he understands something we have forgotten. Something we lost when we gained climate control and artificial gravity and food synthesizers. The knowledge of how to exist in a hostile universe without technology as intermediary. Hour 3 began with Vex's most ambitious project yet, converting a section of the shelter into a functional fireplace and oven. He'd identified a geothermal vent approximately 10 meters from the structure, a crack in the obsidian that released superheated air in irregular bursts, hissing like some geological respiratory system. Rather than avoid it like any sensible being, Vex decided to weaponize it. Using hollow sections of volcanic rock, the kind formed when lava cooled around gas bubbles and left behind tubes perfect for channeling air, he constructed a crude but functional duct. The channel ran from the geothermal vent, underground for about 3 meters where the surrounding earth would moderate its temperature, then up through the shelter's wall into a carefully constructed chamber. He sealed gaps with a paste made from volcanic ash, mixed with mineral deposits that had clay-like properties, creating an airtight system that would contain and direct the heat. Torix had given up on staying in his pod, and now stood nearby, scanners active, recording everything with the fascination of a scientist observing a new species of particularly interesting bacteria. You're creating a convection heating system. The geothermal vent will provide consistent thermal energy. The underground channel will moderate the temperature to survivable levels, and the chamber will radiate heat throughout the structure, while the chimney vents excess. Smart cookie, Vex said, which Torix's translator rendered as approved confection, and caused several seconds of confused silence before context algorithms corrected it to expression of intellectual praise. Chimney goes up through here, vents the excess heat, creates a draft that'll keep air moving through the whole structure. Basic thermodynamics, really. The chimney rose from the heating chamber, constructed from stacked hollow rock segments that Vex had painstakingly fitted together like the world's most improvised jigsaw puzzle. It extended above the shelter's roofline, which was itself a marvel of improvised engineering. Vex had created a slanted roof using flat obsidian slabs, angling it to deflect the worst of the radiant heat and create additional air circulation through gaps at the peak. The gaps were precisely sized, large enough for hot air to escape, small enough that wind wouldn't destabilize the structure. Quinn approached, his earlier skepticism giving way to cautious curiosity that manifested as frequent head tilts and analytical clicking. The structural integrity appears sound, load distribution is logical. But how did you calculate load-bearing requirements without instruments or computational assistance? Vex paused in his work, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, leaving a streak of volcanic ash across his face. Didn't calculate, eyeballed it. Eyeballed. Yeah, you know. Looked at it, figured it'd probably hold. At Quinn's expression of abject horror, which involved his beak opening and closing soundlessly several times, Vex laughed. Humans built cathedrals before we had calculators, mate. The pyramids, the Colosseum, Great Wall of China. Sometimes you just know when something's going to stand or fall. It's pattern recognition, intuition, experience passed down through generations. By the start of Hour 4, the others had abandoned the pods entirely and gathered around the shelter like pilgrims witnessing a minor miracle. The structure now had 4 complete walls, a roof that somehow hadn't collapsed despite appearances, a functioning chimney system that drew air with satisfying efficiency, and what appeared to be a secondary chamber built into one wall. Vex was putting finishing touches on this chamber, creating a sealed space with a small opening at the front and adjustable vents on the sides. An oven, Brask said with certainty, their geological expertise finally proving useful. He's built an oven. A functional thermal processing unit. On a lava planet, Yeren added, their eye stalks waving in what might have been admiration or disbelief. Where the ambient temperature could roast most organic compounds without assistance. It's insulated, Vex explained, gesturing to the chamber's construction with hands that bore fresh scratches and burns that he'd apparently decided weren't worth mentioning. Clay-like minerals from over there, mixed with ash and some mineral compounds I found near that outcropping, creates a heat-resistant coating. The oven chamber is small enough that I can control temperature by adjusting airflow through these vents. Basic convection oven principle. Same technology humans used for bread ovens thousands of years ago. Jakara's form pulsed with light in rhythmic patterns, her species' equivalent of laughter. You've constructed a dwelling with climate control and food preparation capabilities using nothing but stones, geological features, and determination. And spite, Vex added cheerfully, dusting volcanic ash from his hands. Mostly spite, actually. Universe crashes me on a hell planet. I'm not going to sit around complaining about how unfair it is. I'm going to build a house and cook dinner out of pure vindictiveness. The statement hung in the air, translated into 5 different languages through 5 different cultural frameworks, and somehow managed to perfectly capture something fundamental about humanity that the Confederation had been trying to understand for 3 centuries. Humans didn't conquer nature through superior technology. They didn't wait patiently for circumstances to improve. They looked at impossible situations and took it personally. Torix conducted a comprehensive thermal scan of the completed shelter, his instruments painting the structure in false color gradients. Interior temperature 28 degrees Celsius, exterior temperature 46 degrees Celsius. Humidity levels optimal, air circulation adequate. You've created a habitable microclimate through passive cooling, geothermal regulation, and architectural design. This is remarkable. Can we go inside? Yeren asked, tentative in a way that suggested they expected the structure to collapse the moment anyone entered. Vex gestured grandly toward the entrance he'd left in one wall, a opening just large enough for the largest crew member to pass through comfortably. Built it for everyone. Come on in. They filed into the shelter, a procession of unlikely survivors entering a structure that shouldn't exist according to every principle of modern engineering and emergency protocol. The interior was significantly cooler than outside, the double walls and convection system working exactly as intended. The fireplace chamber radiated gentle warmth without being overwhelming, taking the edge off the cooler air without creating the oppressive heat they'd expected. The chimney drew away excess heat, and any atmospheric particulates, creating air quality better than some of the pods had managed. It wasn't comfortable by Confederation standards, but it was survivable. More than survivable, it was almost pleasant. Quinn spread his wings experimentally, finding enough space to fully extend them without touching walls or ceiling. This is remarkable. 4 hours of manual labor has produced results comparable to emergency shelters that require fabrication equipment and power sources. This is impossible, Brass corrected, though their tone suggested they were reconsidering their definition of impossible. 4 hours. He built this functional structure in 4 hours using only materials immediately available and improvised tools. Vex was already fiddling with the oven, testing temperatures by holding his hand near the opening and gauging heat levels through methods that made Torix's scientific instruments weep metaphorical tears. He'd gathered mineral samples earlier, curiosity getting the better of him during his material collection, and now he crushed some of them into powder using a rock against another rock. Mixed with water from the pod's emergency supplies and a few other compounds he'd found that had binding properties, he created a paste that he shaped into flat cakes. "What are you making?" Jacquera asked, her crystalline structure refracting the warm light from the fireplace into dancing patterns. "No idea," Vex admitted cheerfully, arranging the cakes on a flat obsidian slab he'd reserved for this purpose. Probably inedible, might be toxic, could be delicious, though I wouldn't bet on it. But I'm testing the oven, and if it works we can at least heat up our emergency rations properly instead of eating them cold like sad astronauts. He placed the slab in the oven, adjusted the vents with the confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times despite this being his first attempt, and sat back against the wall with a satisfied sigh that seemed to release 4 hours of accumulated tension. The others joined him, settling into the space with varying degrees of comfort. For several minutes, no one spoke. They simply existed in the shelter, listening to the whisper of hot air through the chimney, feeling the warmth without the oppression, and contemplating the absurdity of their situation. "Your species did this," Torix said eventually, breaking the comfortable silence. "Built shelters like this before your technological age. This knowledge is part of your cultural heritage." "Sure," Vex said, watching the oven with the focused attention of someone monitoring an experiment. "For thousands of years, tens of thousands actually. Caves first, then huts, then houses, stone, wood, mud, brick, whatever we could find. Humans are really good at making homes out of things that aren't homes yet. It's kind of our thing." "Why?" The question came from Quinn, genuinely curious now. Why develop this skill so extensively when you could simply wait for conditions to improve? Why not conserve energy and resources? Vex considered the question seriously, his expression thoughtful. "Because waiting felt like giving up, and humans are terrible at giving up. We're stubborn, persistent, and just optimistic enough to think that hitting rocks together will solve problems. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But doing something always felt better than doing nothing, even if the something was objectively stupid." Jacquera vibrated at a frequency her translator rendered as profound contemplation mixed with something approaching respect. "The Confederation has emergency protocols that would have kept us alive in the pods until rescue. We would have been uncomfortable, possibly injured, but alive. Survival would have been achieved through patience and faith in established systems, yet you created this instead." "Yeah. Why?" Vex pulled the mineral cakes from the oven using a piece of metal from the crash wrapped in fabric, examining them critically. They'd hardened into something resembling crackers, though whether they were edible remained questionable. The color was wrong, the texture was suspicious, and the smell was neutral in a way that suggested the absence of flavor rather than the presence of it. Because alive isn't the same as living. Sitting in a damaged pod, counting down 26 hours of misery, waiting for someone else to save us while we do nothing but exist, that's just surviving. This, he gestured around the shelter with genuine pride, is doing something about it. Making it better. Making it ours, even if it's only ours for one day. He took a cautious bite of one of the mineral cakes, chewed thoughtfully while everyone watched with morbid fascination, and his expression suggested the experiment was not a culinary success, but also not an immediate medical emergency. Tastes like burnt regret with notes of geological disappointment, but the oven works perfectly. The others made various sounds of amusement in their respective languages, and for the first time since the crash, the shelter filled with something other than fear or stress. It filled with the particular warmth that comes from shared adversity and unexpected triumph, the kind of camaraderie that emergency situations either destroy or forge stronger than titanium. 22 hours later, because rescue operations were efficient if not speedy, a Confederation response vessel entered orbit around KX-774. The rescue team deployed with practiced efficiency, emergency medical equipment at the ready, trauma specialists standing by, prepared for the worst. Crashes on uncharted worlds typically meant finding survivors in various states of desperation, clinging to life in damaged pods, rationing supplies down to the last calorie, and requiring immediate medical attention for injuries both physical and psychological. What they found instead was a crew gathered inside a stone shelter that looked like it had been standing for years rather than hours, comfortably warm, with a functional fireplace and oven. The human was actively cooking something that smelled suspiciously pleasant, using mineral deposits he'd discovered had flavor-bearing compounds similar to salt and herbs. The others were resting, some sleeping peacefully, all alive and largely uninjured beyond minor scrapes and bruises that came from any crash landing. The rescue captain, a veteran of 40 years who'd seen everything from quantum anomalies to diplomatic incidents involving inappropriate tentacle placement at formal dinners, stood in the doorway of the obsidian shelter and experienced the unique feeling of having her worldview gently but firmly adjusted by reality. "You built a house," she said flatly, her translator rendering her native language's exasperation perfectly. Vex looked up from the oven, where he was preparing what he optimistically called bread, but was more accurately described as edible-ish mineral compote with structural integrity. "Yeah, seemed like a good idea at the time. In 4 hours, well, 3 hours and 47 minutes, but who's counting?" Vex pulled the latest batch of his culinary experiments from the oven. "Want some? It's surprisingly not terrible once you get past the texture and the aftertaste and the way it makes your teeth feel fuzzy." The captain's report to Confederation Command would later become required reading at the Academy, specifically in the course on human psychology and cultural integration. She wrote, "Recommend updating emergency protocols to account for human instinct to immediately begin construction projects when faced with survival situations. Traditional assumptions about waiting for rescue may not apply to this species. Humans appear to view disasters not as situations requiring patience but as home improvement opportunities with aggressive deadlines. Further study needed to determine if this behavior is universal to the species or limited to individuals with engineering backgrounds. Regardless, the results speak for themselves. 7 survivors, 0 casualties, 1 functional dwelling that exceeds minimum habitability standards. The crew of the Meridian's Edge were transported to the nearest station, medically cleared with flying colors that surprised the medical staff, and debriefed extensively about their experience. The shelter remained on KX-774, a monument to human stubbornness and ingenuity. Some claimed it would erode within months, destroyed by the planet's harsh conditions and geological instability. 16 years later, when a geological survey team visited the planet, they found the shelter not only intact but improved. Someone, presumably a human from another crash, or perhaps just a human who'd heard the story and felt compelled to contribute, had added a second room and what appeared to be a rudimentary plumbing system connected to an underground water source. Vex Marlowe returned to his regular duties as an engineer on civilian transports, though he gained a certain reputation throughout the Confederation. Humans, the various species learned, were the species you wanted on your crew, not because they prevented disasters, but because when disasters inevitably occurred, they'd already be planning the housewarming party and debating whether the living room should face east or west for optimal light exposure. The galaxy had spent millennia developing technology to conquer nature, to bend hostile environments to civilized will through force and innovation and the application of sufficient energy. Humanity had spent that same time learning a different lesson, that nature didn't need conquering. It just needed understanding, a little creativity, and the profound stubbornness to look at a lava planet and think, I could build something nice here, maybe add a patio if there's time. Zakara, in her official statement that was published in the Confederation Journal of Xenopsychology, vibrated at a frequency her translator rendered with unusual poetry. We have encountered species with greater technology, superior weapons, and more advanced sciences. We have met beings who can manipulate reality itself or exist in dimensions our minds cannot fully comprehend. But humans possess something we had forgotten was valuable, something we lost in our march toward technological sophistication, the ability to look at nothing and build something, to face the impossible and immediately start sketching blueprints on the back of napkins, to crash on a hell planet and instead of despairing, ask themselves what the kitchen layout should be and whether there's enough space for a dining area. The Confederation of Aligned Stellar Nations updated their emergency protocols that year. Section 7, subsection 12 now read, in situations involving human crew members, be advised that waiting for rescue may not be their first instinct. Prepare for the possibility that by the time rescue arrives, humans will have already addressed the emergency through improvised construction, aggressive problem-solving, or sheer bloody-mindedness. This is normal human behavior. Do not be alarmed.